Hello and welcome to biology. Today we're going to talk about respiration, and we've talked about photosynthesis, that method that primary producers, autotrophs, use to capture sunlight, and they take in CO2 and they build those glucose molecules. Well, those glucose molecules become very important, right? But the question is why? And it has to do with respiration. So respiration eliminates the need for enzymes in metabolism, releases energy from chemical bonds of molecules such as glucose, does not occur in primary producers, or helps primary producers store energy accumulated by chloroplasts. This is your first mini quiz question. Well, you've got this energy stored in the chemical bonds of glucose, and you need to put it into a different molecule that can be used for all of these metabolic processes. So the answer is that respiration releases energy from chemical bonds, such as glucose, or a molecule such as glucose. Now here's the deal though, it has nothing to do with enzymes and metabolism. That's a whole different story, it's a whole different area, okay? And so the first one has nothing to do with anything. Now, respiration does occur in primary producers. It occurs in all organisms because all organisms have active metabolic processes. That's the things their cells are doing to survive. Now, this also, respiration, has nothing to do with chloroplasts. That is photosynthesis. And it's very important as we go through that you're keeping photosynthesis and respiration straight in your mind. So when we talk about respiration, it's the process by which an organism is going to provide its cells with oxygen for metabolism, and you're going to remove carbon dioxide waste, which is a byproduct, right, of respiration. So because you have this whole situation where you've got oxygen and CO2 and you've got to make ATP, there are actually three things that we talk about when we're talking about respiration. Now, when I say respiration, in terms of like photosynthesis and respiration, I am talking specifically about cellular respiration, and that is that process by which organisms make ATP, which is an energy storing molecule that can be used in all kinds of things, okay? Now, you have to be able to get oxygen into the cell, right? And you have to be able to get CO2 out of the cell. And that is going to be an internal respiration in your complex organisms. In external respiration, for single cells or even plants, right, as it's coming in from the atmosphere and things like that. So external and internal respiration can in fact be, well, internal respiration may not be a thing depending on the type of organism that you're talking about. But basically what we're talking about here is you've got to get oxygen from the atmosphere into the cell. You've got to get CO2 out of the cell and back into the atmosphere, okay? All right, now which of the following features do all gas exchange systems have in common? Because respiration and photosynthesis require gas exchange. They're exposed to air, they're found only in animals, they're enclosed in ribs, they're maintained at a constant temperature, or they have moist surfaces. Well, not all gas exchange systems are exposed to air. That seems reasonable because you're talking about the atmosphere, but don't forget there's lots of aquatic organisms too, and the gases are dissolved in the water, so that's right out. It's not only animals, plants, right? Microbes, they all respire. And ribs, well, only vertebrates have ribs, and not all vertebrates have lungs, right? So your gas exchange system is enclosed in ribs, but that doesn't mean any other large groups are doing that. They're maintained at a constant temperature. That's not necessary, right? And temperature is something that's going to come up periodically. Do you need a constant temperature or not? And it depends on the processes, okay? But here's the thing. Gases exchange better through moist surfaces. Water is the key there, okay? And so moist surfaces, all of them. Think about slimy amphibians, the gooey inside your lungs, right? All of that stuff. And I'm not talking about mucus. I'm talking about just that it's kind of moist and, moisty there. All right. So cellular respiration releases energy that you get in your food, right, to make ATP, right? ATP is like Red Bull for the cell. And the overall equation, now this is a very complex, long process. The overall equation looks something like this. Glucose plus oxygen gives you CO2, water, and ATP. Interesting, right? Now, ATP is a molecule that has adenine and ribose, so this is adenosine, This is the same thing that you actually find right here in DNA and RNA, okay? ATP, the T is for tri, and P is for phosphate. There are 3 phosphate groups on the end, or next to this ribose. So you have this molecule that has these 3 phosphate groups. The phosphate groups happen to store quite a lot of energy. So this molecule will undergo hydrolysis, and one of these phosphate groups will pop off. And when that happens, energy is released, and it's a lot compared to other molecules. And so ATP is a very important part of almost all of your cellular processes, okay? Now, comparing photosynthesis and cellular respiration, photosynthesis is about energy capture. Cellular respiration is about releasing it so it can be used. Photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast. Cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. Carbon dioxide and water are necessary for photosynthesis. Glucose and oxygen are necessary for respiration. The products of photosynthesis are glucose and oxygen, and the products of respiration are CO2 and H2O. What? It looks like they are opposite of each other. Now, these are not equivalent things, but it's pretty exciting that the byproducts of each can be used in the other. Okay, and then here are the equations. All right, so just a little side by side there. All right, now internal respiration. Most of the organisms that we're going to be talking about, not plants, but most of the animals we're going to be talking about are vertebrates, okay? And so in vertebrates, you have internal and external respiration. So I just wanted to go over that really quickly. Internal respiration is between the blood and the tissues, the cells, okay? And so oxygen is in the blood, CO2 and goes into the tissues. CO2 comes out of the tissues into the blood, all right? And this is all about, in chemistry, you learned all about like partial pressures and gas diffusion and all of that, and you know, high pressure versus low pressure. This is a really good example of where all of those laws apply, okay? And then external respiration, you got to get this stuff out, right? And so this is the exchange between the blood and, if you have lungs, the alveoli, or, you know, some surface, and then going out into the atmosphere, and it's the same idea. Partial pressure of oxygen is higher outside than it is in the blood, so it diffuses in. CO2 is higher in the blood, so it diffuses out. And by the way, it's really important that you remove the CO2 from blood, because it will actually start changing the pH, and then all kinds of really bad things happen. Okay, so what are the types of respiratory surfaces? The first one we're going to talk about is the integument. This is the skin. Lots of things, or maybe a membrane, okay? Again, I'm kind of talking about vertebrates, right? But this can be true for all kinds of invertebrates or microbes or whatever. You have some membrane or cellular structure that is around that. So in a single-celled organism, it's going to be a membrane. In a multi-celled organism, it's going to be some sort of sheet of epithelial cells usually. And for us, it's skin, okay? No, I don't mean us, I mean vertebrates, like amphibians. I don't mean people. Okay, so amphibians, for instance, do it over the skin. So you have to have this thin, moist, permeable skin, okay? Now, the next type that we want to talk about are evaginations. These are gills, right? This is where you have this specialized respiratory organism that allows water to pass through it, and it increases the surface area so you can actually take in more gas. And then our situation is invaginations. These are your lungs, and they increase the respiratory surface, but they also, because we're all terrestrial, if you've got lungs, you're terrestrial, and it's dry, and so you need to keep it moist, so it's inside as opposed to outside like gills. Okay, so a green plant is kept in a brightly lighted area for 48 hours. What will most likely occur if the light intensity is reduced slightly during the next 48 hours? The rate at which carbon is used will increase, photosynthesis will stop, the rate of oxygen release will decrease, and glucose production inside the cell will increase. Now, what this question is really asking you to do is to differentiate between photosynthesis and respiration. What is actually going on in this plant? So let's think about it. Okay, let me just direct you to number 2 first. If there is light and there is a green plant, is photosynthesis going to stop? No. As long as that plant's alive, photosynthesis is going to be happening. So number 2 is right out. Okay, that's not the answer. But now we need to figure out, is carbon usage going to increase? Will oxygen release decrease? Or will glucose production increase? Now let's think about it. What are the products of photosynthesis? That would be glucose. So if you have less photosynthesis, will you have more or less glucose? You will have less glucose produced. That means 4 is not the answer. Okay? Carbon is an input to photosynthesis. That means that it will not be used as much, because if you're not doing as much photosynthesis, you're not pulling as much carbon, right? So 1 is right out. Another product of photosynthesis is oxygen, right? And so you've got oxygen decreasing because you're not doing as much photosynthesis. But here's the other catch. Oxygen release will also decrease because you're going to have that oxygen used in respiration, right? The plant will still be respiring. Plants respire at night. They respire during the day. They only photosynthesize in the presence of light, but they respire all the time. And so your oxygen is actually going to decrease, not proportionally to the decrease in photosynthesis, because you've got two things happening. Less photosynthesis means less oxygen released, and even more less oxygen is released because you're still respiring. Okay, so what happens if there is no oxygen? You still have to, if you're an organism, have all your cellular processes going on. I mean, this is what you have to survive. You have to do all of these things. So you're going to need ATP, and you're going to have to be able to make it. Respiration is an aerobic process only. It only occurs in the presence of oxygen. But there are lots of anaerobic, right, or no oxygen environments. This is where fermentation comes in. Fermentation is going to occur when oxygen is not present. And there are different results of fermentation. In things that have muscles, you're going to have lactic acid fermentation. And this is what makes your muscles tired, right? For instance, you get all that lactic acid built up. That's after you use up all the oxygen in your muscle. Yeast does a fermentation process. It can either respire or it can ferment, and when it does that, it produces ethanol, which is a great gasoline substitute. But here's the catch about fermentation. Respiration is so common and so great because it produces lots and lots of ATP with not as much energy input. Fermentation has a lot of energy input, but it only nets 2 ATP on top of that, okay? And so this difference in your overall ATP production is huge. So fermentation is not as productive a process as respiration is. Okay, that is it for our conversation about respiration. If you have any questions, please let me know in class, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.